Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about bands and why they are a game changer. And the biggest problem we have with bands when we get into some of these discussions is not even always convincing people that they work, but getting people to figure out how to set them up. Because when we start talking about exceeding about 80 to 90 pounds of band tension, it becomes a lot of trouble to set up. And some people's home gym setups really don't even allow for this because they don't have enough weight and other ways to anchor the weights at the bottom. Like for example, here you guys see me using about 165, 170 pounds for speed squats. I do like 200 pounds for speed pulls, right? That's how much band tension we're running. So when we get into these sort of band tensions, it becomes hard to really to attach them, right? It becomes hard to attach them. And it's a problem of even people say, hey, how do I attach this? Well, you have to figure it out because it's going to take different plate combinations and objects and stuff that you use to hold them down if you don't have really good peg setups. So the thing that we have to remember with bands is that they don't work the way that people think they do. What do you mean? What do you mean, Jason? All right, a lot of people confuse bands and chains because they're used oftentimes so interchangeably, apparently from for different strength athletes and sports. People assume the purpose of bands is to add weight at the top. They just assume that that's what we're doing, and the reality is that's not necessarily the case. Meaning the top versus mid-range difference is actually very, very little on bands when you set them up. So, for example, let's say you're running 100 pounds of band tension compared to 100 pounds of chain tension. Which one is generally going to be more difficult? Well, the bands. The bands are. They're going to be harder. They're going to be much harder in certain ways. And the reason we say that is that with chains, you might have, with 100 pounds of chains, let's say you have a 30-inch range of motion, right? A 30-inch range of motion. At the bottom, if you set up correctly, there's no real chain tension added in terms of accommodation, mainly your lead chains and whatever links at the bottom, but that's just part of your weight. So you have 200 pounds on the bar and 100 pounds of chains. Well, at the bottom, basically that means you got 200 pounds. At 10 inches up, right, at 10 inches up, you have maybe 33, 34 pounds, okay? At 15 inches, you have 50 pounds. And at 30 inches at your full lockout, you've added 100 pounds. If you set the chains up to be that way, they're consistent, they're linear. Every link in the chain of a given length of chain weighs the same as the link behind it. So every inch that you add, it has a linear curve. It just adds weight. It doesn't change the resistance curve itself other than just simply adding weight in a linear fashion from top to bottom. Okay? Just adds weight as you go. With bands, it's not a flat curve. If you set up bands correctly, right, such as what you see right there with that bench, right? If we set up bands correctly, with something like that, that's a 65-pound band. At the bottom, it's probably adding 5 pounds. It's 65 at the top, but at the midway point through the rep, it's probably still 60. Meaning, once you stretch a band so many inches, about half through its stretch cycle, it's at something like 90%. The bands, once you start stretching them, right, because we should have some tension at the bottom, what happens? They increase exponentially. The curve is exponential. It rapidly increases, and then it stabilizes and flattens out. Okay, so 100 pounds of band tension, if it starts with any stretch at the bottom, is going to be something like 90 pounds of bands at the halfway point. Whereas with the chains, it was 50 pounds. All right, the other issue we run into with the bands is that you have to outrun the bands. When you stop moving, bands pop. You're storing energy in the band as you accelerate, and the faster you accelerate, the harder the band pulls back. So you have to learn to outrun bands, both for speed work and for heavy work. You have to outrun the bands. And the bands are very aggressive on your lockouts. Okay, they add a completely different eccentric curve also. What do we mean? When you unrack a heavy band on a weight, you feel it trying to jerk you down immediately because you have all that band tension. You have to stabilize the weight on the starting the eccentric rep. It will tend to jerk you down differently than straight weight does because it has a destabilizing effect. It creates an overspeed effect on the eccentric rep that you have to fight against as it starts to lower. Once you unlock the joints, you have to fight against that eccentric. It creates a different type of eccentric overload. So you have to stabilize it. And then when we explode against bands, if you go too slow, the bands catch up with you and they tend to jerk you back down. Especially once we pass the halfway point. And that band is now at least 90% resistance. That last 7 or 8 or 10 inches or whatever it happens to be for your exercise and range of motion, if you do not outrun the band, it tends to rebound energy on you, and it has a tendency to jerk you back down. The deadlift, it will try to jerk the bar out of your hands near the top, right? It's more intense on your grip. The squat, it will try to jerk your upper chest down and then pull you back down. So what we have to learn to do with bands is that they teach us to explode faster. They give us a faster rate of force production. Okay, this makes us more athletic. It has the potential to make us more athletic, more explosive. Now, people will say, but Jason, the big three are not speed strength lifts. Well, you can argue that they aren't, but it still helps. In other words, if you can accelerate them faster, you're going to tend to blow through sticking points easier. Band work is good for getting rid of sticky points that are not the lockout. Chains tend to be a little better at pushing you through the lockout because they increase linearly all the way up. Bands force you to learn to explode through sticking points further down the curve because you have to, or you don't outrun the bands and they tend to defeat you. Okay, it's a completely different strength curve. So training with bands versus chains actually is different sticking points, even with the same technical tension and weight. It's a different sticking point. Chains teach you to have to learn to lock a little harder at the very end. They change the deceleration. Bands force you to have to accelerate through the bottom and mid-range faster. They bring a lot more to the table for speed. And I'm not saying chains don't for the contrast weight. So people will also say, well, why not just use bands for everything? Well, I use bands for a lot of small stuff, by the way. I do a lot of rear delts and triceps and everything these days with bands. In fact, all the time. It's like a daily thing for me. The issue, people say, why don't we just use bands for everything? They tend to give us less development in certain antagonist muscles, right? Opposing muscles don't get worked as effectively with bands. And we know this based on some data out there. And not that that matters completely, but it does matter. Number two, bands are very hard on your recovery. Because of the eccentric component, the way they're different, they cause more micro tearing. They're harder on recovery. So if we do everything with bands, we're not going to be able to get as much training volume in. We're going to tend to get more sore. We might run into problems with opposing muscle groups. So just like any other tool, we use them, but we don't use them exclusively. And that's one of the big mistakes that happens anytime we bring up any good tool. People want to say, oh, well, let's just use that all the time. That's all we should. If it's a good tool, we should use it for everything. Well, no, not necessarily. Not necessarily ideal. We need to vary our different training responses, our training loads, our stimulus. So no, we don't want to use bands exclusively. But we need to use them often. And they're a very, very valuable training tool for increasing speed strength, for increasing rate of force production. And they're actually a pretty damn good hypertrophy tool. And they even have their place for a restoration tool. But we shouldn't be using them exclusively, obviously. There are problems with that. And this is from someone who uses them very, very heavily. I do a lot of band work, as you guys know. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.